Is it working now? Yes. So thank you for joining the permanent mission of Rwanda to the United Nations and the World Jewish Congress for this special event today. I would first like to present Ambassador Valentine Ragwabiza, the permanent representative of the Republic of Rwanda to the United Nations, for her opening remarks.
Good morning. Is it working? Not sure. Can you hear me? Very good morning, and I first of all would like to welcome all of you to this morning event, and thank you very much for responding to our invitation, our joint invitation of the World Jewish Congress and the Permanent Mission of Rwanda to this event, which is really an event, a memorial event to commemorate Raphael Lemkin incredible work and the Genocide Convention at 70, from definition to implementation. That's an incredibly big subject, but we do have on the panel this morning very important experts, and we really expect that they will be able to enlighten us not only on the work that has been done by Raphael Lemkin, but also on how we can make this work much more relevant today, and how we can be faithful to what has been the mission of his life. Lemkin dedicated himself to a cause of uplifting humanity by championing the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, the Genocide Convention. The convention, as I said it today, 70 years old, but with an history that we can't be proud of. It is nonetheless for us to take time, and important for us to take time, honor Raphael Lemkin with tireless efforts, greatly influenced the introduction of the very concept of genocide in international law. Lemkin himself was deeply affected by genocide. He and his brother Elias were the only members of the more than 40-strong Lemkin family that survived the Nazi occupation of Poland and the Holocaust. With such personal devastation, he channeled his experience not towards bitterness or hate, but towards strengthening the legal instruments available to respond to genocide worldwide. His passion, his belief in humanity, his commitment should really serve as an important call to all of us. This morning, we will listen to experts. We will also listen to a survivor of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, my country. We will listen to all these different angles, and we hope by listening to them and receiving your own input, we'll be able, at the end of this morning, not only to understand better how we could really make the convention do what it was made for in the spirit of Lemkin. We will also honor the work of Father Patrick Debois, who is carrying the torch of the likes of Raphael Lemkin to ensure that crimes of genocide never go untold and unpunished. In less than 2 weeks, here at the UN, at this very UN, we will begin in Rwanda, we'll begin to the annual commemoration of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, where more than 1 million Tutsi were killed in 100 days. At the time, the convention was already 46 years old. The convention was already that strong instrument that we have today. However, the convention didn't enable the Security Council to take its responsibility. The convention didn't prevent the failure of the Security Council. So it is really some of these questions that I would like us, and we would like you to help us explore this morning. It was not by lack of knowledge. The killings were presented and were broadcast. The force commander of the United Nations peacekeeping mission at the time, General Dallaire, reported, first of all, about what was going to happen. And once the genocide started being executed, instead of strengthening the mission, what the Security Council decided was to withdraw all the peacekeepers who were then in the country. And yet we had the convention. We had the convention and the obligations. And the Security Council spent a lot of time making sure that the word genocide will not be used, despite all what was happening. So I think, without dwelling too much today in this history, let's think about some of these questions. Would an enforcement mechanism strengthen the convention? What do we need to do here at the UN, but also outside the UN, to really make sure that the work of Lemkin serves its purpose? What kind of justice is there after a genocide? After a crime of such magnitude, what kind of justice can we talk about? And international justice gives a voice to states, gives a voice to the defense team, almost never to the survivors. So what can we do also to make sure that we have an international justice system that is much more effective than what we have today? Ladies and gentlemen, I realize that I'm putting up more questions than answers. It's simply because, humbly, I don't have answers. And I hope that together this morning, we will help each other understand better and suggest some of the possible answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I want to personally extend a thank you to you and your team at the Permanent Mission of Rwanda to the United Nations for giving the World Jewish Congress the honor of hosting this event in cooperation with you. I will not be giving formal opening remarks, just a very brief introduction. The World Jewish Congress, from its inception in 1946 in Geneva, Switzerland, has been dedicated to the fight against mass atrocities and persecution. In 1942, then WJC Secretary General Gerhard Reigner alerted the world of the Nazi Holocaust in the historic Reigner telegram. Throughout the years, speaking up against human rights violations has been a cornerstone of WJC activity. WJC President, Ambassador Ronald Lauder, is a vocal advocate of the fight against persecution of all people, against all forms of contemporary anti-Semitism, hatred, xenophobia, and bigotry. As chairman of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation, he ensures that history remains a vivid reminder to all generations to work tirelessly to prevent recurrence of the horrors of the Holocaust. But as the ambassador noted, we as humans have failed. When I first visited Rwanda in 2010, only 16 years after the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, hearing the survivors speak and seeing the sights of horror, I felt as if I was in the torn shoes of my Holocaust surviving grandparents. It is my mission to be here today to learn from the past, be hopeful for the present, and honor those such as Father Patrick Dubois who dedicate themselves to prevention and to justice. The panel speakers today will take us from history to current days and into the future. They will each give short remarks, and we will follow with questions from the audience. Our panelists, who I'll present before they speak, include Professor Yehuda Mirsky from Brandeis University, Mr. Menachem Rosensaft from Columbia University and Cornell, Mr. Chris Harland, the legal advisor for the permanent mission of the International Committee of the Red Cross to the United Nations, Ms. Liliane Pari Umuhoza, a survivor of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and Mr. Castro Wasamba, the head of office at the UN Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. Our first panelist, Mr. Yehuda Mirsky, is a professor of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis, as well as a faculty member of the university's Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. His courses are on human rights, Zionism and Israel, and Jewish intellectual and religious history. He received a BA at Yeshiva College, a JD at Yale, and PhD in religion at Harvard, and rabbinic ordination in Jerusalem. He worked in Washington as a Senate aide to Bob Kerrey and Al Gore, at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and a special advisor in the U.S. Department's Human Rights Bureau during the Clinton administration. From 2002 and 2012, he lived in Jerusalem and was a fellow at several think tanks and was one of the founders of Atnoa Yerushalmit, a pluralistic grassroots community organizing network. His scholarly work, such as it is, focuses on the interactions of politics, religion, and culture, and his work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, Haaretz, among many other venues. He's the author of the award-winning volume Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution. His book, Towards the Mystical Experience of Modernity, The Making of Rav Kook, is due out in the coming year. His next book project is tentatively titled Rethinking Human Rights Law, Politics and Theology. Professor, please.
Thank you very, very much to everyone. It's a great honor to be here, and it's an honor to honor Father Dubois. And thank you to the World Jewish Congress, and especially to its tireless and very patient staff, Ifad and Noah, and thank you all. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about Raphael Lemkin. I assume that most of us know the basics. He was born in 1900, passed away in 1959. A Jewish international lawyer from Poland, the key architect, not the only one, but a key figure and sort of the most important theorizer and indispensable man in the creation of the idea of genocide and the Genocide Convention. Now, what I'd like to talk about is that one of Lemkin's greatest contributions is his deepening and enlarging our sense of what it is to be part of a group and what it is to be a lone human being, especially in an historical time when both those issues are of profound moment, to say the very least. Now, what's the idea of genocide? The idea of genocide cognizes a group not necessarily constituted by the state, but entitled as a group to protection from the state itself, and protection by the state, and protection from other states. Now, individuals, of course, certainly by the terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are protected by the state. But in speaking of the group and inscribing the group into law, belonging to a group becomes part of the bundlehood of rights, of personhood vis-a-vis the state. A part of that bundlehood of rights that the state and states are obliged to protect. Now, what kind of groups are Lemkin talking about? Was Lemkin talking about? Crucially for Lemkin, interestingly, and perhaps a little surprisingly, not necessarily an organic group. Lemkin's key insight, one that he shared with other liberal and humanistic nationalists, was that a group is an individual writ large. This is an idea that one finds among many thinkers. In Zionist terms, Aaron David Gordon is perhaps the most important. So, but back to Lemkin. As you cannot murder an individual, so you cannot murder a group. By the same token, the individual does not lose themselves in the group to which they belong. They can choose to belong or choose not to belong. And a morally decent state must recognize that freedom of choice even as it protects the integrity of the group. Right? So it's a really interesting, complex, in some ways very liberating idea. Now, Lemkin here was not theorizing in the abstract, but out of concrete experience, as a Polish lawyer in the interwar period committed to international law, and as a Jew. Like many other Jewish students and thinkers of the early 20th century, Lemkin found himself, as Jews throughout history, but this issue presents itself with, the question I'm about to discuss, presents itself with particular salience in modernity. Lemkin found himself at one and the same time an individual with a mind and conscience of his own, and the member of a group, a nation without which he could not understand himself. Right? That's a sort of a key insight here. And that nation, in his case the Jewish nation, was, and in minds of a number, regularly still is, under threat of destruction. Protecting the elemental rights of one, he understood. Protecting the elemental rights of the group to exist necessarily means protecting the rights of the other, the individual. Protecting the rights of the individual means protecting the rights of the group to whom the individual belongs and in and through which the individual realizes their own personhood. And again, Lemkin is theorizing here not only Jewish experience. He's theorizing, as many thinkers were, the experiences of other ethnic, cultural minorities who envisioned, and at times, in particular in the late Austro-Hungarian Empire, thought they experienced a kind of autonomy in the making that held the promise of enabling multiple groups to live as groups under a shared umbrella of the liberal state and the rule of law. Now, Lemkin in his memoirs and elsewhere in his public life did not dwell a whole lot on the elements of Jewish thought here, in part because Jewish experience was not the only experience that was relevant for him, of course. The Armenian genocide loomed large. And also because he wanted to make the point that this was an idea of universal applicability, but it's really interesting and telling that the one Jewish thinker who Lemkin mentions in his memoirs is Simon Dubnov, the great historian and the apostle of idea of Jewish cultural and limited political autonomy in the sub-state, under a sub-state structure. And indeed, when Lemkin is running away from Hitler, he actually makes the time to go visit Dubnov before he goes. And Dubnov is interesting. Dubnov is not a Zionist, but he was not anti-Zionist. He was sort of un-Zionist. Lemkin, though, was a Zionist, and here I'm drawing, as in so many things, on the remarkable researches of my colleague Jim Leffler, author of the recent wonderful book, Rooted Cosmopolitans, History of Jewish Rights and the Jews and Human Rights in the 20th Century, a book in which the World Jewish Congress and its history figure prominently. Lemkin was both a Zionist and an apostle of international law and human rights for groups and individuals, and he was not alone in that. Leffler talks about other figures, including some who worked here at the UN and others who were important in the World Jewish Congress, like Ronald Protzweig and Jacob Robinson. Right? Someone like Robinson, who was principal author of the Refugee Convention and at the time the legal advisor to Israel's delegation to the UN, and for whom there was no contradiction. Now, back to the Genocide Convention. Implicit in the Genocide Convention is the notion that extermination of the Jews is perhaps not sui generis, but is paradigmatic. The sui generis nature remains in designating a specific, and the paradigm here is in designating a specific category of crime, genocide, distinct from other crimes against humanity, sort of that coinage of Hirsch-Lauterpacht. Now, an advantage here is that in terms of moralizing the lives of states, is detaching genocide from aggression and war crimes, right? For Lemkin, genocide can take many forms. Killing people is one of them. Forbidding them to, say, study their language is another. Not enabling them to affiliate with one or to choose to affiliate with one another as a group is another. In Jewish terms, in Jewish terms, making the Holocaust a paradigm rather than sui generis moment is of a piece with the liberal nationalism Lemkin was trying to uphold and build, and which, of course, takes special significance in our world today. So what does that have to do with all the things we were talking about today? First, states have been doing horrific things to groups and individuals since antiquity. It was Lemkin who most clearly saw state-sponsored murder of nations as nations, physical and cultural, as a distinctively modern crime. Second, the idea of genocide, and more specifically the understanding that the idea of genocide urges on us of what it means to belong to a group and for groups to be protected, not only during times of crisis and conflict, but no less importantly, during times when conflict is not aflame. The idea of genocide sensitizes us to how the ties of peaceful society can and are to be woven together. And indeed, that may be part of the legacy of genocide today when, under the terms of international law, it's much easier to mobilize the troops to say, stop the cross-border aggression of Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, than it is to stop a genocide in progress, in part because this speaks to some of what was already discussed. The Genocide Convention, right, by its terms, has a kind of doomsday device in it. When I was in the State Department, we saw this regularly. Once you call something genocide, you have an obligation under international law to act, which perversely creates a disincentive to labeling things as genocide. So we talk about acts tantamount to genocide, acts constituting genocide, things that look like genocide if you look this way or that. So rather than simply, it might be tempted to hollow out the idea of genocide, but it need not be so hollowed out if we understand its key insight about what it means to enable decent societies to function, be open to themselves. We are left with the challenge of recognizing affective ties and the necessity for politics and the necessity of solidarity for decent politics, even though solidarity seems to make decent politics impossible, and the concept of genocide tries to ease the strain of that challenge, a strain that always, in which law can help, of course, but can only be ultimately addressed by the moral will as expressed in politics, as expressed in all our lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Yuda. Our next panelist is Mr. Menachem Rosensaft. Born in the displaced persons camp of Bergen-Belsen, the son of two survivors of Auschwitz in Bergen-Belsen, Menachem Rosensaft is General Counsel of the World Jewish Congress and Senior Advisor to the WJC CEO on Holocaust Legacy. He's an adjunct professor of law at Cornell Law School and instructor in law at Columbia Law School, teaching at both institutions about the law of genocide. He received his JD degree from Columbia Law School in 1979, after receiving an MA degree from the writing seminars of Johns Hopkins University and a second MA in Modern European History from Columbia University. He serves on the advisory council of the Foundation for Memorial Sites in Lower Saxony, Germany, including the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. He was appointed twice to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council by President Bill Clinton and twice by President Barack Obama. Rosensaft is the editor of 3 books, The World Jewish Congress, 1946 to 2016, God, Faith, and Identity from the Ashes, Reflections of Children and Grandchildren of Holocaust Survivors, and Life Reborn, Jewish Displaced Persons, 1945 to 1951. He's also my colleague from whom I have learned a lot in the past few years. Menachem.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you very much, Ifat, and thank you for your initiative in organizing today's program. Ambassador Rugwabiza, Father Desbois, ladies and gentlemen. This past November, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Court of Cambodia, known as the Cambodia Tribunal, determined that the Khmer Rouge had committed genocide against the Muslim Cham minority and the Vietnamese minority during the Pol Pot-led reign of terror between 1975 and 1979, and convicted 2 surviving Khmer Rouge leaders of genocide. Both had previously been convicted of and had received life sentences for crimes against humanity. This was the first time that a court had concluded that the Khmer Rouge had perpetrated genocide against members of the Cambodian people, even though at least 1.7 million Cambodians 17% of the population had been murdered. More specifically, it is estimated that around 100,000 of 250,000 Cham Muslims and around 50,000 Vietnamese were murdered by the Khmer Rouge. The remaining more than 1,680,000 victims of the Khmer Rouge, including intellectuals, doctors, teachers, religious leaders, and just about anyone Pol Pot considered an enemy of his fanatical agrarian utopian ideology, are acknowledged to have been victims of crimes against humanity, but not genocide. Inherent in this distinction is the absurd, not to say profane, implication that genocide is a greater crime than mere, in quotation marks, crimes against humanity, or that a perpetrator of crimes against humanity should somehow be considered a less reprehensible criminal than a genocidaire. Unfortunately, by referring to genocide as the crime of crimes, the subtitle of Professor William Schabas's masterful treatise on genocide and international law, this is precisely the erroneous misconception that has become all too commonplace in the popular and often even in the legal understanding of genocide as a criminal cause of action. Today's program is dedicated to the memory of Raphael Lemkin, who, as Professor Mirsky pointed out, coined the term genocide in his 1944 book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, and to the impact the Genocide Convention has had over the course of the past 70 years. We would be remiss, however, if we did not place genocide in its historical context alongside crimes against humanity, which also emerged in the aftermath of World War II as a novel charge as a novel criminal charge in international criminal law. While Lemkin in the summer of 1945 actively promoted, some of his contemporaries viewed it as lobbying single-mindedly for the use of the term genocide in the prosecution of Nazi war criminals, a more senior authority on international criminal law, Professor Hirsch Lauterpacht of Cambridge University, recommended to Justice Robert H. Jackson, the chief prosecutor at the contemplated International War Crimes Trial, that a different but equally original and untested criminal cause of action, namely crimes against humanity, be included in the charter of the International Military Tribunal, the IMT, to cover atrocities committed against civilians. Jackson was persuaded, and he in turn persuaded his British, Soviet, and French counterparts. Under Article 2 of the Charter of the IMT, crimes against humanity apply to, quote, murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane act committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecution on political, racial, or religious grounds. This new cause of action was unprecedented and extremely controversial. For the first time, individuals, including high-ranking government officials, could be held criminally accountable before an international judicial tribunal for the severe mistreatment and systematic murder of civilians, including their own nationals. 30 years earlier, on July 16, 1915, Henry Morgenthau, the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, alerted the State Department from Constantinople that, quote, deportation of and excesses against peaceful Armenians is increasing, and from harrowing reports of eyewitnesses, it appears that a campaign of race extermination is in progress, end quote. Subsequently, Morgenthau had written in his memoirs that, and again I quote, technically, of course, I had no right to interfere. According to the cold-blooded legalities of the situation, the treatment of Turkish subjects by the Turkish government was purely a domestic affair, end quote. As we know, the statute of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, and of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, as well as the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, each contain the Crimes Against Humanity cause of action based on the IMT Charter's formulation. In the summer and fall of 1945, the prosecutors preparing for the IMT were largely ambivalent, if not unenthusiastic, at the thought of introducing yet another new concept into the document they were drafting. Nevertheless, Lemkin's persistent, by some accounts obsessive, importuning on behalf of the term genocide eventually bore fruit. When the indictment of the major Nazi war criminals was handed down in mid-October, the defendants were charged with conducting, quote, deliberate and systematic genocide, that is, the extermination of racial and national groups against the civilian population of certain occupied territories in order to destroy particular races and classes of people and national, racial, or religious groups, particularly Jews, Poles, and Gypsies, and others, end quote. Significantly, this solitary reference to genocide in the indictment was not in connection with crimes against humanity, but rather in the section on war crimes. Lemkin then, to the annoyance of other members of the team that had drafted the indictment, made sure that the new word's official recognition was heralded in a news item in London's Sunday Times on October 21st, 1945, together with mention of the fact that it had been coined by Professor Raphael Lemkin of Duke University, who is now in London. This was the first formal use of the word genocide in a public legal document. Thereafter, the proposed legal definition of genocide evolved almost schizophrenically. In December of 1945, UN General Assembly Resolution 96-1 was unanimously adopted, calling for the drafting of a genocide convention. This resolution expanded the term considerably, covering crimes, quote, committed on religious, racial, political, or any other grounds, end quote. The initial version of the convention, drafted by the UN Secretariat's Human Rights Division, then went substantially further and focused on cultural and other grounds. To make the long story short, various delegations, the United States objected to cultural genocide, the Soviet Union objected strenuously to the inclusion of any political groups, and so forth. The end result was that the convention as adopted focuses on national, ethnic, religious, or religious groups. In other words, the definition of genocide as we know it is and has been a compromise. The question that I think we need to ask ourselves today is whether or not we would have been better off with a convention for the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity based on the IMT Charter with genocide as a subset, so as to avoid the implication that those who do not fall foursquare within the definition of the Genocide Convention are somehow guilty of a less venal crime. Nonetheless, however, and in the words of an overused contemporary cliche, the Genocide Convention is what it is, and we must be grateful that we have it at all.
Thank you, Menachem. Our next panelist is Mr. Chris Harland. Chris Harland is the Deputy Permanent Observer and Legal Advisor at the ICRC's Permanent Observer Mission to the United Nations in New York, where he arrived in the summer of 2018 after serving as the ICRC's legal advisor in the regional delegation for the United States and Canada based in Washington, D.C. Prior to this position, he held ICRC legal positions in Kuala Lumpur and New Delhi. He worked in the legal division of the ICRC at its headquarters in Geneva from 2004 to 2007. Prior to joining the ICRC, Mr. Harland held positions with the United Nations in the Cyprus referendum, was a member of the High Judicial and Prosecutorial Councils of Bosnia and Herzegovina, was the head of the Human Rights and Rule of Law Department of the Office of the High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina, participated in the UN Secretary General's investigative team in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and was a legal officer with the UN's Human Rights Commissioner's field operation in Rwanda. He has also worked in the Office of the Legal Counsel at the UN headquarters as an intern, I won't say when, and clerked with a judge of the Federal Court of Canada. Please, Chris.
Excellencies, colleagues, friends, thank you very much to IFAT and the World Jewish Congress and to the government of Rwanda for organizing this event commemorating 70 years of the Genocide Convention and for the invitation offered to speak. I've been asked to say a few words on the work of the International Committee of the Red Cross and how this relates to the Genocide Convention. First, I would like to highlight the links between the 1948 Genocide Convention and the 1949 Geneva Conventions, in particular the Fourth Geneva Convention on the Protection of Civilians. Second, I'd like to outline elements of our protection work around the world and its link to the prohibitions set out in the Genocide Convention. And third, I wish on a personal note to highlight the importance of doing this work and the work of today's recipient of the Raphael Lemkin Award. As mentioned, from 1996 to 1998, I worked in Rwanda with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and saw the impact of the genocide on the people of Rwanda. Allow me first to highlight the link, therefore, between international humanitarian law and the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention, of course, sets out in Article 2 a series of prohibitions as described by our earlier speakers. These prohibitions are framed in reference to one of the four groups that are mentioned: national, ethnical, racial, and religious. It should be stressed that, of course, individuals are the targets of the acts prohibited by the Genocide Convention. The Geneva Conventions, which were updated 8 months after the adoption of the Genocide Convention, they reflect this fact. And they include in their grave breach provisions many acts similar to those in the Genocide Convention. For example, in the Fourth Geneva Convention, the prohibitions against protected persons or acts against protected persons, which include willfully killing a protected person, causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, inhuman treatment, are also joined by the prohibitions against unlawful deportation, transfer, and unlawful confinement. While the Genocide Convention applies at all times, it has a slightly more restrictive framework because of its focus on protecting the group. On the other hand, the 1949 Geneva Conventions apply only during armed conflict, but war crimes may be committed without a larger intent requirement against, for example, one protected person. Thus, the two bodies of international law are complementary and together provide a wider and more protective framework. Second, the ICRC's protection and prevention work, which links to international humanitarian law and to some degree the Genocide Convention, it seeks to guard against violations of both bodies of law. For example, in times of armed conflict and other situations of violence, the ICRC carries out activities to assist and protect the civilian population, and that's one of the main goals in areas where, for example, there exists an armed conflict. We seek to ensure, among others, that family members are able to remain in contact with each other in such times. We also visit those who are detained, and many of these may be targeted because they belong to one of the four groups which are enumerated in the Genocide Convention. Regularly, we shape, alter, and augment our protection activities when we see the risk increasing for violations of international crimes, including both in the Genocide Convention and in the Geneva Conventions. In addition, part of our what we call prevention work with states is to implement international crimes into domestic law. One of the ways we do this is through the implementation of the International Criminal Court statute, which of course in Articles 6, 7, and 8 has genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Some countries also incorporate the crimes in the Genocide Convention directly into their penal code or in special laws on the 1948 Convention. The website Legal Tools currently lists 84 countries with Genocide Convention-related implementing legislation. I would argue that more still and can be and should be done in this respect. Finally, thirdly, on a personal note, let me express the pain I felt when I saw the devastation of communities resulting from the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Shortly after I arrived in Kigali, and before taking up my position in Ruhengeri, I took part in the exhumation of a mass grave, together with the relatives and friends of those who had been killed. And the horrors of 1994 became real for me that day. It's important to remember that these events happened and to not forget them. It's therefore fitting that you give the Lemkin Award today to Father Patrick Desbois, who has spent much of his life ensuring that such victims of genocide are not forgotten. In conclusion, international humanitarian law and the Genocide Convention have strong links forged through the catastrophes of the Second World War. The ICRC, through its prevention and protection work, seeks better respect for these bodies of law. Essentially, both IHL and the protections of the Genocide Convention are about people. By not forgetting those who have suffered, we honor the memory of the past, and we are part of ensuring a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Our next speaker is Miss Lilian Pari-Umuhoza. Lilian, born and raised in Rwanda, is currently studying peace and conflict at Juniata College in Pennsylvania. She is the founder of the Retreat for Women Genocide Survivors in Rwanda, a program that offers psychological and financial support to the women who experienced rape during the genocide. In summer 2017, she was a volunteer at Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum in Israel. She has been a guest speaker at the Oregon Historical Society Museum, Peace and Justice Studies Association Conference, the Embassy of Rwanda in Washington, D.C., the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, Duke University, Tufts University, and the University of Leeds in the UK, to mention just a few. She is dedicated to supporting violence-affected communities. She uses her life experience of surviving the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and her education for advocacy and activism to create awareness, educate people, and raise her voice for those who cannot raise theirs. Please.
Thank you. Is it on? Okay. Sorry. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the World Jewish Congress and the Rwanda UN Mission and everyone who participated to make this event possible. My heart breaks every time I visit the Kigali Genocide Memorial, specifically at the children's spot. I don't know if anyone in this room have been to the Kigali Genocide Memorial. The children's spot speaks a lot to me because I can relate. I was 2 years old during the genocide, and looking at the stories and the pictures of those children, it's always a reflection and a reminder of what I've gone through. If the Rwanda Patriotic Party, RPF, didn't take action, I wouldn't be here today. As who were young during the genocide, we don't recall much of what happened, but we grew up facing the consequences of the genocide in every corner of our lives. We grew up in a country that was completely destroyed, not only the infrastructure, but also the people around us were heartbroken, carrying fresh scars, both invisible and invisible. I feel deeply honored that today, after going through a long journey of healing, I am able to support my fellow genocide survivors, women specifically who experienced rape during the genocide, and who today are raising children that they conceived from that atrocious experience and are HIV positive and many other consequences that they carry from the genocide. Current challenges that survivors are facing, of course, trauma. It's been 25 years since the genocide in Rwanda. And a lot of people tend to forget, or maybe to think that with time, it gets better. But healing and time are two completely different things. Today, the survivors that I know, and even including myself, when they tell their stories, it's as if it happened yesterday, because everything around them is a memory of what they have gone through. One example is the women who are HIV positive that I just talked about. When they tell their stories, they say that taking pills as HIV positive is itself a reminder of what they have gone through. And there's no way that they cannot turn their backs from that memory. Speaking of that, I would like to go straight to the point of the reason we are here, which is to see how we can prevent these horrors to keep happening. And one thing that today the Genocide Convention should really put much effort in is eradicate the culture of impunity. The Genocide Convention was established to prevent and punish actions of the genocide. One of the biggest concerns for us, the survivors of Rwanda today, is the early release of the perpetrators and of the perpetrators of the genocide. And fighting impunity, the culture of impunity, is one way of delivering justice in the aftermath of the genocide. And it is a crucial part of prevention. The tribunal, such as the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, ICTR, can play an important role in making this possible. Culture of impunity for survivors who have been resilient in trying to move forward, it's really re-traumatizing, and it doesn't help in terms of healing and, of course, trying to keep surviving, which is a battle that survivors fight every day in their daily lives. Seeing perpetrators around without facing justice, it brings back their memories of what they have gone through, and sometimes there is a high chance that they feel unsafe that what they have gone through may happen. Strengthening penalty for the genocide deniers. Denying the genocide is one of the next stages after the genocide. This is a common concern to the survivors from all genocide backgrounds, and it's a form of re-victimization to the survivors who have gone through one of the traumatic events in the history of the world. We are here, and the Genocide Convention was implemented because we failed in the past, because of the failure in the past. So what can we do today? What are we learning from that failure, which is learning from the past? What are we learning from all the violence that happened, the genocides? And as I said this, think about the Rohingya people, community, think about what they are going through. So it's time that we sit down and talk about action, instead of always sitting down thinking about what we can do. We need to act. Because when we act, we save lives, and also preventing is less expensive than dealing with the aftermath. Looking at the rise of racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of extremism today, if the convention is not strengthened, the history will repeat itself. Another way of strengthening the convention is by assisting survivors to prevent the cycle of violence. And when I say assisting survivors, I mean psychological support, because from my personal experience, without healing, it's so hard for the survivors to move forward. And psychological support is really, really important for someone who have experienced violence and a crime like the genocide. Also, other forms of support. There's a lot of survivors who are living in total poverty because of so many reasons and many other consequences that are related to their experience during the genocide. To conclude, it is important for international organizations such as the UN to use their power and influence to make never again a reality. This can be done by bringing those responsible for such atrocities to justice, which was Raphael Lemkin's main goal. Also by supporting the survivors, creating awareness and taking action early when violence breaks out. Also to remind people that in today's world, where mass atrocities are being more common, only through collective, consistent effort, these dreadful crimes can be prevented. Also, to always remember that this is a responsibility that we all share. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lillian. Our last panelist is Mr. Castro Wasamba. Mr. Castro Wasamba joined the United Nations in 2008 as a political affairs officer in the Department of Political Affairs. He has worked as an advisor on Africa region in the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect for over 10 years. Between 2016 and 2017, Mr. Wasamba served as a senior political advisor to the Special Representative of the Secretary General in South Sudan, as well as Deputy Chief of Staff of the United Nations missions in South Sudan. Prior to joining the United Nations, Mr. Wasamba worked for the government of Kenya for 13 years, serving in different positions covering regional peace, security, human rights, and other multilateral issues. He was an expert delegate to the Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs Committee of the UN General Assembly for the committee between 2001 and 2005. He served as coordinator of the African group of the Third Committee of the General Assembly. He's currently the Chief of Office of the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Mr. Wasamba holds a Master's of Arts in International Affairs and International Law from St. John's University, New York, and a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from Kenyatta University in Nairobi. Please.
Thank you, Yvette. Your Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first, let me join other panelists to express our appreciation to the World Jewish, I'll start over again. Your Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first let me join other panelists to thank the World Jewish Congress and the Permanent Mission of Rwanda for organizing and inviting us to this very important event. And being the last speaker, I'll just quickly share with you some reflections as where we are with the Genocide Convention. I think we have had very powerful presentations in terms of like how the Genocide Convention was coined by Raphael, the word genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, the negotiations leading to the Genocide Convention itself, and a very powerful statement that Lillian has just presented in terms of seeking justice for the survivors of genocide on itself. 70 years ago, on 19 December 1948, world leaders were very unanimous in adopting this convention and saying never again to the horrible crimes that were committed during the Holocaust, and adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This was a time of hope that future generations will be spared from falling victim to this heinous crimes. 70 years later, it is important to acknowledge how much has been achieved. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was also marked its 70th anniversary last year, the broad spectrum of human rights treaties adopted since then, as one of the panelists has presented on international humanitarian law. We have adopted the Rome Statute and established the International Criminal Court. All these demonstrate how far we have advanced in the international legal framework for the protection of human rights. However, as much as there have been these accomplishments, there have also been many challenges. The genocides that took place after the adoption of the 1948 Convention, particularly as Mr. Rosenfeld has referred to the genocide verdict in Cambodia. We have had presentations on the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and the genocide that took place in Srebrenica. We all know that this could have been prevented. But today, not only do we continue to witness ethnic and religious tensions in various parts of the world, but worryingly, there has been a dangerous increase in the number of situations that merit our urgent attention. The extreme forms of identity-based violence that we have witnessed in such places as Central African Republic, Iraq, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen are unacceptable. But equally, the intolerable serious violations and abuses that are being committed against the protected groups under the Genocide Convention, and as Lillian has just made reference to what is happening to the Rohingya population in northern part of Myanmar, and other part, wherever other crimes that are happening in other parts of the world, just to name a few, is of really concern. Also of concern is the growing wave of populism that is slowly eroding the enjoyment of rights and promoting the rise of anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, hate speech, and hate crimes in many parts of the world, even in where we have been very much confident of stable democracies. Migrants and refugees are being vilified and denigrated in many parts of the world. All this should raise alarms to us. However, we must regret to say the level of complacence is also very strong. So what can we then expect for the next 70 years of the convention? First, we need to be prepared for the new challenges, to think a bit creatively in what prevention is. Lillian has outlined some of the prevention parts. I will add in what she has said that we must find a new way to address the rise of the intolerance that is growing across the world. Of course, we have seen the power of the new technology and the dissemination of hate messages and denigration of certain groups across the world using the new technology. Of course, these new tools have brought many opportunities of hope for the prevention of these international crimes, but also it's creating a concern in terms of its misuse against certain groups on itself. Secondly, we must also realize that the prevention of genocide and other international crimes is a job that requires commitment and support of each of us. It's not just the UN, it's not just certain countries, it's up to every individual to contribute towards prevention. There's need to strengthen, but not to pull away from regional and international cooperation and multilateral institutions to respond to dramatic challenges in today's crisis. This means committing the necessary political support and resources to turn prevention into reality. I think everybody agrees that we have to do in prevention, but there's very little investment in that prevention itself. Thirdly, having said that member states have signed on these international legal frameworks, we must recommit to these obligations and match those commitments with their deeds. It's not just enough to sign the Genocide Convention or the human rights treaties or the Rome Statute, but also to implement these obligations. Norms are there to protect us and to allow us to solve these disputes peacefully. The genocide is the ultimate form of disrespect for this legal framework that the international community decided to establish when it created the United Nations over 70 years ago. As of today, we must say that we have 44 United Nations member states that have not acceded or ratified this convention. For this reason, the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide continues to call for the universal membership of this Genocide Convention. Finally, I must say the international community must be prepared to do more to turn genocide into a crime of the past. We must fight for a world where people are no longer targeted because of their color, of their skin, their ethnic background, their religious faith, or by any other form of identity. While we cannot undo the failures of the past, we can at least learn from them and strive to prevent genocide and other atrocity crimes. Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists. Well, I have many questions myself. In the interest of time, I'm happy to open for any questions from the audience, and you'll have to just press a button to speak. Let me see. Is somebody in the back? Yes. Yes.
With Burma Task Force, an NGO. Can't hear. Is this on? Yes. My name is Adam Carroll. I'm with Burma Task Force, an NGO, and we work in consultation with the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities of Myanmar, of Burma. Obviously, I appreciate, and we appreciate the mention of the Rohingya and the current genocide that they have been suffering. My question is, Myanmar signed, or rather ratified, the Genocide Convention many decades ago. What do? They deny the fact of genocide, despite all the UN and other reports. The mechanisms, they don't cooperate with the special rapporteur and so forth. We see that there's legal structure, but lack of political will, and there's lack of political will in this institution as well, in the Security Council, obviously. So my question is about the obligation to act. As was mentioned earlier, whether that's a disincentive. We believe that what's happening is a genocide, and therefore there must be action. We also believe that R2P is an important concept, and yet we see a lack of response. What about alternatives, and what about the Uyghur in China? Do we call that a genocide, or strategically do we use other terminology? Is that stepping back and being weak? What do panelists think? Thank you.
I'm happy to take another question if there's another question in the audience. Yes, please.
Basuni, David Basuni, a former UNICEF staff, and one of the positions I held in UNICEF was as a special representative for the Palestinian authorities based in Jerusalem. More importantly, I come from South Sudan. And we have, of course, the tragedy of the Holocaust. We have the tragedy of Rwanda. We have Myanmar, the Rohingya. We have South Sudan. We have Syria. And one would have thought that at this time, in the 21st century, when technology has brought information and treasure to our fingertips, we would be sensitive to learn of the lessons of the past. But we are seeing genocide continue. We're seeing more cruelty, more insensitivity than ever before. So my question to the panel is, I respect and appreciate everything that you're doing, your studies and research and so on. But why is the world becoming more cruel than ever? Why are we insensitive to human lives and human dignity? What can we do to prevent this? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy I don't have to answer any of these. I saw one more question, and then I'll let the remarks. There. One more. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Maher Margarian. I'm the permanent representative of Armenia to UN. And I want to thank the organizers of this event to commemorate the legacy of Raphael Lemkin and also to commemorate the 25th anniversary of genocide against Tutsis in Rwanda. In Armenia, we hold the memory of Raphael Lemkin very dear to our hearts and to pay tribute to the life and the work that of Raphael Lemkin. In December, a street was named after Lemkin in Armenia. My question to Professor Mirsky, he spoke about the disincentives of calling certain events as genocide because of certain legal repercussions. So if you can elaborate more on that and how the international community can address such disincentives. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll let the panelists respond. We'll start from Nachem. Please keep it short.
Well, very, very briefly, Mr. Wesamba has pointed out, and we've heard again, the numerous, almost countless instances of atrocities, whether genocide or not, that have taken place even over the past 70 years since the convention has been in place. And what we have to remember, and that maybe that addresses the last point to a certain extent, the convention is supposed to prevent and punish genocide. We have done a fairly adequate, I would say B- job with respect to punishment. We have been absolutely a failure in prevention, and the convention does not provide any guidelines as to what prevention means, which is why governments try to avoid the word, because they do not know what it is that is required of them. Is it economic sanctions? Is it military action? Is it denunciation? It does not, and as you know, bureaucracies by definition don't want to do anything they are not specifically directed to do. And therefore, I'm afraid that we have the document, but we have yet to find a mechanism to ensure that the atrocities, the horrors, whether in Rwanda, in Srebrenica, against the Yazidis, against the Rohingyas, are in fact perpetrated.
Thank you all, and I thank the three questioners who all put their finger exactly on the issue. I think what we're talking about here is the larger crisis of human rights, and human rights is dramatically in crisis. For years now, you know, with all due respect to the august institution in which we're sitting, what does it mean that we've come to a point where we sort of expect that UN human rights bodies will be chaired by dictatorships, and that dictatorships will have the governing say? What does it mean that there is not a single figure on the ground anywhere in Syria who has a reasonable expectation of being hauled to The Hague in anything like the coming decades, when we see the remarkable efforts that have been taken by the Rwanda Tribunal, that how long it's taken for Mr. Karadzic finally to be brought to justice. So then the question is, I mean, because then obviously politics intervenes in a million and one ways, political will, bureaucracies, and everything. So I was thinking as Mr. Harland was speaking, that perhaps one of the reasons that the ICRC is able to succeed in the ways that it does is precisely because, by definition, it takes its mission outside of politics. So then the question is, what do we do with human rights? Do we junk the whole thing? Do we toss it all out? That is where to that I would say no, because the idea that there was at least some sort of international consensus in the mid to late 20th century, however imperfect, however hypocritical at times, that there are some things that states are not allowed to do, is a precious thing, not least because it gives hope to all kinds of people in desperate situations all over the world. So what do we do? What somebody like me tries to do, what I tried to do briefly in my remarks here, is to do a kind of excavation. What was it behind these tangle of ideas of human rights, crimes against humanity, genocide, democracy? And they're not all the same thing. They're not all the same thing intellectually. They're not all the same thing in terms of the groups and the people who propound them. They're not all the same thing in terms of the directions in which they go. But there's profound intellectual excavation that we need to do to try to recapture what are some of the basic insights here, what are some of the basic insights and mechanisms that can be meaningful within domestic regimes, that can help us think forward. And speaking to the question from His Excellency from Armenia, part of the problem here is that it's precisely states that care about their obligations under international law that are reticent to evoke, as Mr. Rosensaft was saying, in obligations that are not clearly spelled out. All sorts of countries have no problem signing on to treaties and declarations that they know they have no intention of abiding by. That is one of the dilemmas here. I don't have easy answers, and I sit in the academy and I try to think some of this through, but I do think that what we have, but I think the intellectual effort that's required is one to recognize full well that the human rights system as we know it is in protracted collapse in many, many ways, and from that recognition we can start trying to rebuild.
Thank you. And yes, those are very good questions. I don't have the answers. Just to maybe highlight one tension that we have in the ICRC is do we speak publicly about what we see, and what do we call it when we need to speak out? As many of you will know, the International Committee of the Red Cross has a reputation of actually being quite quiet, going about doing its work, and we believe that one of the reasons why we've been successful in a lot of countries in the world in contexts where it's difficult to get access is because we don't, we speak bilaterally and confidentially to the parties and explain the issues that we see and try to work through them. There are very few exceptions to that, but one of them was on the 28th of April, 1994, our delegation in Kigali expressed a number of concerns about what was happening with the words systematic carnage, and that we saw the extermination of a significant portion of the civilian population, and that was extremely rare for the ICRC, and it was a very difficult decision. We didn't use the word genocide, as Philippe Gaillard, who was a delegate on the ground, explained a few years later, because of the concern that our staff would just simply be executed. By staying on the ground, we were able to save some 9,000 people in our hospitals, is what our records show. So these are very difficult situations or decisions for people on the ground. And as I say, I don't have any answers, but I applaud the questions.
So I'm in a peace and conflict studies field. That's my field of study. And referring to the question, why is today's world more violent than ever? The quick question to this is because we think of violence when we see blood flowing like a river. That's when we think of violence. That's when we think that we need to take action. But if we could refer to what to Galtang's triangle of violence, I don't know if you're familiar with that, where he talks about structural, cultural, and direct violence. I think we can do this work better of preventing the violence to keep happening. Cultural violence is all those beliefs that divide people instead of bringing them together. And the structural violence is those laws that are implemented that perpetuate violence. And all of these are the ones that lead to direct violence when we see people killing each other. And but also we need to think on an individual level, what are we doing in our power? How are we raising our voice about what is happening? And someone mentioned technology. How are you using social media to create awareness and to educate people about the violence happening and what we can do? What are you doing in your community to help people come together, to help people support each other instead of being separated and looking at what is different between them? So I think also that's something that we need to remember, that we also need to think about our participation in preventing violence to keep happening on a personal level.
Thank you, Yvette. Very quickly, but before I make the responses, I would just want to make one little caveat. One is that, for the United Nations, we do not characterize crimes. We leave it up to the courts to determine what crimes have taken place. And therefore, when I speak about specific situations, I'm not trying to say that the United Nations is characterizing the crimes that are taking place in those situations. For example, I will respond to Adam's reference to the situation in Myanmar. We would like to say that whatever, other panelists have pointed out, that there are serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law that are taking place that actually prompts us to take action. As they always say, going back to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, it did not start with the machetes. We had all the signs that we could do to prevent that. And we are in the business of saying we are doing quite a lot of prevention, but why is it not working? One is that, for example, the situation in Myanmar, the UN has the Commission of Inquiry has made conclusions that possibly some of the acts that are being committed against the Rohingya could constitute the crime of genocide. And that should be worrying enough for the international community to respond to this. But the response has been muted. Who is supposed to respond? Of course, we know under the Genocide Convention, and as I said in the opening statement, genocide, the crime of genocide, constitutes a threat to international peace and security. And therefore, we expect that the institution responsible for international peace and security might be one of the first responses to that. But unfortunately, because of the political divisions that exist in the Security Council, they have not been able to make any decision on the situation in Myanmar. While the Commission of Inquiry has said possibly those acts that are happening is a crime of genocide. So what is happening is lack of political will. But political will cannot be just bought in a store or wherever. We have to cultivate it. There are quite a number of member states, civil society organizations, various entities that are lobbying member states not to use a veto in the Security Council when there is actual information that can make us believe that crimes are being committed. We lobby member states not to use a veto, because using a veto is basically exposing that population to a very high risk. So we must all do our part by urging member states particularly in the Security Council, not to use the veto. I would also like quickly to mention that when it gets to prevention, where these crimes are happening, because that means we have failed, the immediate member states in the region needs to respond and create that political will. So we must ask the neighbors, what are they doing also to do the prevention? Then the last point I want to mention, and we'll touch on what David asked about why the cruelty. Partly it's because of the impunity that exists. If you look at most of these very serious situations, ongoing situations, one of the driving factor is because there's nobody who is being held or thinks they will not be held accountable. I'll start with South Sudan. David, you mentioned South Sudan. The violence has been going on since 2013. The African Union, established a hybrid court because they don't want to go to the ICC, okay? And there is no political will in this region to refer these perpetrators to the International Criminal Court. So the Africans said we shall create a court and we're going to punish those who have committed these very serious violations in South Sudan. Has it happened? No. Is violence still going on? Yes. Is anybody being held anywhere for these crimes? No. So that is part of it. And I can go on to mention what is happening in Syria. We can't refer the situation to the ICC, but there's no any mechanisms that we can hold the perpetrators accountable, the same situation in Myanmar. So I think in summary is that if we have to do prevention, we have to honor the obligations that we have committed ourselves to. Otherwise, it just becomes another, hollow discussions that we are engaging in. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists for this morning. Thank you very much. And as you know, we're here to honor Father Patrick Dubois. And I would like now to give the floor to Adam Hummel, who is a member of the World Jewish Congress Jewish Diplomatic Corps program and one of the motivators behind this event. Please.
Jewish Diplomatic Corps and an immigration lawyer from Toronto, Canada. It is my distinct honor to be here today to present the Raphael Lemkin Award for exemplary work in the fight against genocide to Father Patrick Dubois. Before I introduce Father Dubois, however, I thought I'd perhaps say a few words about Raphael Lemkin, who is, of course, the namesake of this award. As we've heard today, Raphael Lemkin is the man who coined the word genocide and who ultimately pushed for the adoption of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide at the UN on December 9th, 1948. He was a character and has been described as awkward, singularly focused, a nudge, and someone who is ultimately dedicated to the rule of law. Now, Lemkin is known to have had three great fears in his life while growing up: that he would go bald, that he would need glasses, and that he would become a refugee. Well, fleeing from the Germans as they invaded Europe in 1939, and Poland specifically, making his way to America, both balding and bespectacled, Lemkin's three fears had come true by the age of 39. However, despite these fears, and embodying the Hebrew maxim of tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, shall you pursue, Lemkin made a monumental impact on the development of human rights law over the last 70 years. Now, even though this year marks the 60th anniversary of his death in 1959, his name and his deeds have largely been resuscitated over the last few years, being given posthumously the recognition that I imagine he would have been uncomfortable with during his lifetime. And as someone who I understand he used to hide out in some of the rooms in this building, I don't know how he would feel about his name being projected on all these screens in this room today. But this awkward Jewish lawyer who lost 49 family members in the Holocaust indeed made a lasting impact. Now, from the moment that I first heard about Raphael Lemkin and his impact on the world of human rights, I've been nothing less than a fan. A picture of Lemkin hangs on the wall in my office, and I'm constantly reminded of how great an impact one lone voice can have when you see that the world is ripe for change. With the recent 70th anniversary of the Genocide Convention having come and gone, I asked the World Jewish Congress to create this award because I believe that Lemkin should not only be recognized for the work that he did and how his love of the law pushed that work forward, but that Lemkin should also be recognized for the fact that it was also his religious background, his Judaism, and as we heard today, his Zionism, that pushed him to pursue justice by any means. Though perhaps not a Holocaust survivor in the strictest sense, he essentially escaped Europe at the start of the war, his life was both shaped tremendously by his Jewish upbringing, the war and the Holocaust, the way these events impacted his co-religionists, and I've always admired his ability to consider his surroundings and find solutions to problems. He was relentless, admired, and respected. As we have already heard about today, when Lemkin was a young lawyer, he heard about crimes where many thousands, if not millions, had been killed, just like in Armenia, and was perplexed by this notion that a law did not exist to prosecute those responsible for such acts. He set out to define a crime with no name, eventually naming it genocide, wanting to ensure that people no longer committed such crimes with impunity. This became his life's work and is today his legacy. Today, we honor Father Desbois for his life's work. Father Patrick Desbois is a distinguished author, professor, historian, forensic detective, and human rights activist. He has dedicated his life to fighting the bigotry that fuels the disease of genocide and bridging the divide between faiths. His ongoing work brings closure to the victims and survivors of genocide and calls for legal justice for the perpetrators. In the same way that Lemkin sought to name a crime that did not yet exist, Father Desbois has sought to find and name those victims whose lives were cut short by the perpetration of that very crime. As Lemkin shed light on the legal means by which to pursue the perpetration of this crime, Father Desbois has shone a light on the witnesses to those atrocities, encouraging them to speak up before it is too late. In these ways, Father Desbois' work is a very real extension of what was started by Lemkin. Father Desbois is the founder of Yachad in Unum, Together in One, a nonprofit organization dedicated to discovering genocidal practices wherever they are found, providing documented proof of crimes against humanity, and a leading voice of protest on behalf of all past and present victims of mass murder. Yachad in Unum's original charter was documenting the evidence of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, called the Holocaust by Bullets. For nearly 20 years, Yachad in Unum pioneered the application of modern forensic research to the study of genocide. Through this developed methodology, they have uncovered the location of more than 2,300 killing sites and documented more than 5,700 witness testimonies to the war crimes of the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi death squads. He has written 3 books about this work. The first, Holocaust by Bullets, a priest's journey to uncover the truth behind the murder of 1.5 million Jews. The second, In Broad Daylight, the secret procedures behind the Holocaust by Bullets. And recently a third, The Terrorist Factory, ISIS, the Yazidi Genocide, and Exporting Terror. Today, Father Desbois' work is far from over, while Yachad in Unum has vigorously expanded its scope of anti-genocide vigilance. He has spent the last several years with Yachad in Unum teams gathering testimony from survivors of the Yazidi massacres in northern Iraq at the hands of ISIS. The work has resulted in hundreds of hours of eyewitness accounts of this modern-day genocide. While the organization continues to collect evidence of the Yazidi genocide, they have also established skill advancement centers in refugee camps to help former captives transition back into society. In January 2016, Yachad in Unum founded the Museum of the Holocaust in Guatemala, the first Holocaust museum in Central America. More than 50,000 students have visited it so far. In November 2017, Father Desbois and Yachad in Unum launched the Holocaust by Bullets Enhanced Teacher Training Seminar to over 50 current and future educators in Denver, Colorado. The program is designed to help educators with the tools and resources to teach the recently discovered history of World War II. In 2013, Father Desbois began teaching at the Program for Jewish Civilization in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University as an adjunct professor. In 2015, He became a Brahmin endowed professor of the practice of forensic study of the Holocaust at the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University. Father Desbois has also received numerous honors for his groundbreaking work, including the Humanitarian Award from the US Holocaust Museum and the 2017 Lantos Human Rights Prize. Notably, Yachad in Unum and Father Desbois have been lauded by world leaders, including Pope Francis, as well as French President Emmanuel Macron, who awarded him the Légion d'honneur, France's highest honor, for his work documenting the Holocaust. He also serves as director of the Episcopal Committee for Catholic Judeo Relations under the auspices of the French Conference of Bishops. Father Desbois travels extensively for speaking engagements and has been featured twice on 60 Minutes. He resides in Washington, D.C. and Paris, France. And before he comes up to speak, we'd like to show you just a brief video of the work that he and his organization do. Ladies and gentlemen, the inaugural recipient of the Raphael Lemkin Award for exemplary work in the fight against genocide, Father Patrick Desbois.
Thank you. You know, when I hear all what I did, it's like if I was already dead. So thank you to the World Jewish Congress, who was even part of the builders of my non-profit, Yachad in Unum. Thank you to the Rwanda government. I was a few days ago in Johannesburg, inaugurating the first Holocaust and genocide centers, which shows both Holocaust and Rwanda genocide. So effectively, since 15 years, we go from village to village after working with archives in all the countries of post-Soviet Union. We go from Lithuania to Azerbaijan because it was a killing continent. And same time now we work in Guatemala to teach Holocaust, and we go also from family to family in the Yazidi camps of IDP. I know all of you are experts, so I will tell you what we found. First constatation, there is no genocide without the neighbors. When you want to kill a population in a country, if they are Jews, if they are Roma, if they are Tutsi, or if they are Yazidi, you need the neighbors. You need the neighbors. They are not necessarily guilty, but you will choose the neighbors to be alive, and you will choose this population to die. What did it mean? For the units who killed the German, we estimate is more than 2 million of victims, only the Jews, plus the Gypsy. They had a special strategy that worked well, unfortunately. First, they decided who will be the shooter. They took this decision one day before. So they say, you, tomorrow you'll be shooter, because one day a German can be a shooter and the next day he can be a driver. When the German, they know they will shoot, they drink all the night, because they know they have to wake up at 4 o'clock and to drive to the village silently. But before that, the German joins the village and they send an architect with the specialist of the digging of the mass grave. And he goes to the city hall, German, and he asks how many Jews are still alive, and he will calculate the volume of the mass grave according to the number of people we want to kill. You must understand there were two kinds of mass graves. Mass grave when people were killed from the top and were falling down, and mass grave with stairs where the Jews were forced to go down and lay on the corpse. It was called Sardinenpackung. But what we discovered and what I show in my second book was very difficult, is that when they know they will assassinate a village, a Jewish village or a city, they surrender the village with machine gun. And for the neighbors, they know it's the last day they can enjoy something from the Jews. So at the morning, every policeman said, I could rape 3 girls, I could rape 4 girls, I could rape 5 girls. It was difficult to reach this evidence. I will never forget, I interviewed a survivor from the ghetto of Minsk. He was a teenager, he was Jew, and he was hidden in a room, and suddenly he saw 3 Germans raping the Jewish neighbor who was 14 years old. And the family, Jewish family, of course, went out to protect the girl. The Germans shot the girl and finished the rape. And I will never forget what he told me, because after he was sent to Auschwitz, he told me, at least in Auschwitz we could sleep. I say that because in a genocide, the rape is not a collateral problem. It's completely part of the genocide and done in broad daylight. And in most of the time, we don't speak about it. We saw in the Gestapo of post-Soviet Union, Jewish sex slaves who have been used in every Gestapo. So after the German, the mass grave is ready. They drive in the night to the village, and they want to meet everybody, and even the cooker, because they want to eat in time. I interviewed 3 women who were cooking during the shooting. One lady, she told me, they dressed a long table near the mass grave, like a buffet, and 2 by 2 they went to shoot Jews, and I was serving food, and they wanted big pieces of meat, and she told me at the end of the lunch, it was 1,500 Jews less. I say that because I discovered that the killers go on their usual life during a killing. They are chosen to be alive, so they want to have good life. I will never forget, I found the testimony of a German. He was delivering sandwiches in Babi Yar to the killers. So he had a van with sandwiches and tea. And he had to drive between the naked Jews waiting to be shot until a table and putting the tea in the sandwiches. And he received a complaint from the German that there was no vodka in the tea because it was a 3-day shooting, so the chief said no vodka, otherwise they will be drunk. So we have on one side the life of the people who is their normal life, a day of killing, and the death of the neighbors. So after the Germans, they surrender the village and they say, don't worry, we deport you to Palestine or to Kiev or to work, but mainly in Palestine. I remember an interview, an Ukrainian lady, she saw her neighbor, Jewish, in a line, and she began to cry. And the Jewish neighbor said, don't cry, we go to Palestine. And the Ukrainian lady said, no, you don't go to Palestine. I saw the mass grave just behind the church this morning when I was with my cow. And the German told her, stop to speak with the Jews. So the Jews make a long line in the middle of the street, 5 per 5. Why 5 per 5? Because Himmler wanted to know exactly how many Jews were shot, so there was a counter. And suddenly there was somebody says, direction Palestine. And so they walk. The trick was to make the mass grave, to dig the mass grave in the same direction that the train station most of the time. So the Jews think really they will take the train. And suddenly no more train station. Links, rechts, it's finished. The Jews realize they will die. So the women take all their jewels and throw them. And sometimes, you know, it's very moving. We find wedding rings, medallion, Magen David. So for me, it's both an evidence that the victims were Jew, because we have to prove the victims were Jew, because deniers today say Holocaust never existed. But in the same time, it's the last jest that this woman did before to die. And always, I think in my heart, we found you. You died in 1942, but we found you. And after they said to the Jews to lay down on the grass, and they will isolate them 5 per 5 or 10 per 10. Why 5 or 10? Because 5 shooters, 10 shooters. They established a rule, 1 bullet, 1 Jew. It was a request to make economy of ammunition for army. So it means if Jews were only injured, or babies, or too old, they were pushed and buried alive. And in every village, farmers remembers the mass grave took 3 days to die, and they always make this movement. I will never forget, I interviewed in Simferopol in Crimea, a lady, she was 4 years old, and she was shot with the family, but in fact she fell down, she was not injured, and she succeeded in the night to wake up and to escape through the roots of the trees. She was naked. It was a big mass grave of 11,000 Jews. And she went naked to a family of Ukrainians who saved her. And she was still living when I made the interview a few kilometers from the mass grave of 11,000 people. And the same day, they will wash the suits, sell them by auction, take the belongings of the Jews house by house, and in every village, any country, people said we were all suited in Jew. There is no genocide without replacement. You take the house, you take the belonging. So I always say that because the genocide is not only a hate crime, an anti-Semite crime, it's also to take the belongings and the money. As I say always, the SS was not a non-profit. And so also to take the girl. So it's always ideology, sex, and money. There is no pure anti-Semite, there is no pure hate groups. I never saw an SS say, I don't care the money. You know, when you work long time in post-Soviet Union, you begin to think that the countries are very bad. But when we began to work in Iraq, there was no Polish and no Lithuanian and no German, or a few ones, but in ISIS. And we began to interview the Yazidi. We have actually helping more than 400 children Yazidi who have been brainwashed, who don't remember even their name, and who have been trained as terrorists. And we are helping also more than 1,000 women to make a future without any male in the family. But we interviewed also 300 Yazidi. We interviewed them just when they escaped, and I found a similarity. ISIS, when they surrendered a village of Yazidi, they made a deal with the neighbors. No genocide without the neighbors. So then suddenly the Yazidi wake up, and they see that all the roads are blocked by the neighbors. And I will never forget the testimony of this young child. He was Yazidi, 6 years old, and his best boyfriend, they were friends in the school, told him to come to play in his house. So he went to play, and the neighbor, the other child, he closed the door, and he called ISIS to say, I have a Yazidi in my room. So this child, he said, I will never forget, I have been arrested because of my best friend. There is no more best friend in a genocide. And so they do the same thing. The roads are blocked, the cars of ISIS are arriving and say the same music, don't worry, no crime, convert to Islam, it's only a changement of nationality, and have to go to administration to receive an ID. You know, some Yazidi don't believe. If they don't believe, really, they are shot. But most of them say, okay, let's put a white flag, say we are Muslim, and they go to the city hall. When they enter in the city hall, it's a big room, they close it. Doctors are entering, they take all the newborn babies, they put them in a truck, and they will give them to radical Muslim family of ISIS. And until now, the families are looking everywhere, where is my baby? After, doctors enter also to check if the girls are virgin or not. Because the mothers, they realize they will take their girls, so they give them a wedding ring and a baby. So they isolate each girl to check if she is virgin, and they will be sold by a group of 200, 300, and after put in jail and sold again and again. A girl who goes out of ISIS today has been sold between 25 to 35 times. And remembers all the name and the faces. I will never forget this woman. She was 37 years old. She told me, my memory is no more good. I have written the list of all the male who raped me. It was a long list. And so after, they will isolate the boys. If a boy is more than 11, he will be shot, like all the male. But if he's from 7 to 11, they will take them, put them in an Islamic school of ISIS in Mosul during 1 year and a half. And after they have a test to pass in Raqqa, the test is to know the exact list of people it's legal to kill by religion and by country. If they succeed the test, they are put in some training camps in Syria, secret training camps of ISIS, and progressively are being sent to the front. And the older people are shot. So I saw, I will not be long. First, no genocide without the neighbors. Today also, no genocide without advertising. You know, for the killing units of German, we have found 400 pictures taken by the killers. But it was not pictures of propaganda. It was family souvenir. I will never forget this shooter. He sent a postcard to his wife with a picture that he took. And he said, my dear love, you saw we are playing with Jewish children like balloons. We throw them in air and we shoot. Imagine if we don't do that, what the Jews will do to Germany at the next generation. See you soon, my love. So most of the pictures we have are family souvenirs because they are proud. They were Überman, Superman. Nothing stronger than to be a Superman legalized to kill. You know, they took a lot of pictures because many Germans had Leica at the period, and it was very easy to do. So it was not secret. The genocide of the Jews, 2 million .2 shootings every day during 3 years, was completely in full broad daylight. And I never saw a shooting that had to stop because of Red Army or because of the neighbors. Because everybody wanted the belongings. The second thing, you know, ISIS, they are the champion of the mediatization. Until now, people, one member of my team, Mark, who is the general director of here, we are 29 full-time in Paris, plus a team in Guatemala, plus a team in Iraq. We receive every day the video of ISIS. So, you know, you listen to some president to say, ISIS is dead, but on your website, you have video of propaganda of ISIS every day, until now. So it's a dead we're speaking. And so they did a lot of video. You know, even us at the beginning, we screened their video to know what they did, where it was, where was the crime. But at the end, one day they killed 30 men like animals. And so we couldn't even bear the video. So I say, more a genocide is shown, more it's secret. More it's advertised, more it's secret. Why? Because the normal population cannot bear it. The normal population can say, oh, Father is too graphic. Me, I teach in Georgetown, so always I say, I will show you something graphic. Always somebody says, oh, Father is too graphic. And I understand. But they are not afraid to show graphic and graphic every day. So the public opinion say, oh, no, it's too graphic. And the followers say, we will join. So more you show, more you attract followers, and more the normal population will not say anything. Anything. Don't forget, all the mass crime we have been advertised didn't provoke anything. So more it's advertised, less we see. Secondly, the problem that we have with the Yazidi is that nearly nobody knew the Nazi Yazidi before. Myself, I never heard about the Yazidi. So it seems when you kill a population who is not well known, like the Jews of Soviet Union, far away in Caucasus, near Azerbaijan or in Crimea, if you kill the gypsy in the middle of nowhere, and you kill a Yazidi that nobody knew, the time you react, the time you make meetings, it's finished. All genocide are quick. But also a big challenge. I never saw a slow genocide. They know that time is against them. So they have to do it quickly. I would say I stay optimist. I teach in Georgetown, another one is teaching in Sorbonne University in my team, another one is teaching in Cologne, Germany, and we make teaching of professor of high school. I see many young generation who say, I will do something. I will not stay behind my screen making Facebook. It's a genocide because killers, they don't care Facebook. They use it. So I would say I'm very optimistic. A full new generation have a question, what can I do to stop it? Not to memorize it when it's finished. Because that is good, but too late. But too late. What can I do? And I see nonprofit working on the ground. With very small money, we can do a lot. And I'm great admiration for all the big organizations who do much more. But I would say the first thing is to act during the genocide. Today, genocide of Yazidis is not finished, by the way. There are still many Yazidis who are in the middle of nowhere, in Syria, in small village, that are still keeping to make money to sell them back. We must act. Because, you know, I stay a believer. And the first question of God when Cain was killing Abel is, where is your brother? Or your brother was being assassinated. And I think each one of us, when we will arrive after death, they will not tell us where was your president. God will not tell us where was United Nations. He will tell us where were you yourself. And we will have to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call up Ambassador Valentine Rugwabiza to provide our closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Father Dubois. I really thank you very much for what you just said, and I can't think of a more deserving awardee of the first Lemkin Award than yourself. So thank you very, very much. After the words of Father Dubois, really, I will have nothing else to add except just reminding all of us that there is no genocide without the participation of neighbors. It means there is also no prevention of genocide without the active involvement of neighbors. Let's all, at individual level, in the groups we belong to, strive to be that neighbor who don't stand by, who doesn't stand by, those neighbors who don't stand by, that neighbor who doesn't stand by. Let's really strive to be that neighbor who will take a stance. And I think we listened to to the brilliant panel earlier this morning. The genocide is a state-sponsored crime of crimes. It is state-sponsored. And that in itself explains the negative incentives. That in itself should question all of us. A state-sponsored crime of crimes, and yet we are asking other states other states, colleagues, other states with which they have built solidarities at the United Nations or elsewhere, we are asking those other states to be the ones to take the first position, to be the one to stop. But that's where the negative incentive is. In 1994, as the genocide against the Tutsi had been planned and was about to be executed, the government that had planned and was planning the genocide, the government of Rwanda, was a member of the Security Council. How was it possible to dream of any principled position, any stance from the Security Council? Those executed were being executed, and the government that had planned that was sitting on the Security Council, lobbying permanent members, making sure that no action will be taken before what they called the final solution, before the execution. So what can we learn from that? We can learn from that, and I would like us really to live on a positive note after all very difficult things we have had. And for me, the positive note is the following. Those same neighbors in Rwanda that have contributed, that really took all what was given to them to kill their neighbors, and in some cases to kill and exterminate part of their own families, if members of their families were Tutsi. These same people, few decades down the road, and now we are able to bring the people together. It doesn't mean that we don't face challenges. We face challenges. But again, it is a choice to be that person who says, no, we stop here. It takes incredible courage to say, no, we are not going into a circle of revenge because it will never end. We want a better future. Yes, we refuse a culture of impunity. But at the same time, we want to build in the people being those neighbors who are their neighbors' keepers. And we want to get to a point where there is an absolute zero tolerance to expressions of extremism, be they called anti-Semitism, expressions of extremism. We want to build an absolute zero tolerance. And I would just end here by saying again, thank all of you. We are today, at least in Rwanda, we can tell you, we are our keepers. We are our neighbor keepers. And the reason we have put in place a system that will make the never again, it is making it the reality that we live today. We are not complacent because we can see the moment you become a little bit complacent, then again, the rise of extremism, all form of extremism, and we have learned. We know exactly what can be expected from the international community. So I really want to call all of you here to live by saying, you know, we are the international community, start with each one of us, and start with our ability to build coalitions that will absolutely refuse to give space to extremism and to give space to extermination. Thank you very much.